Welcome to our lecture on German foreign policy 1890 to 1913. Now you will recall from the domestic policy lecture that the dates that we focused on were 1890 to 1914. I have made this foreign policy lecture just got until 1913, and that is because we need to focus specifically on 1914 in a separate lecture. Because that will allow us to examine the real short-term explanations for the outbreak of the First World War. Okay, we are going to examine a number of things in this lecture, but we'll start off with some general points about Germany's place in the world as we approach the 20th century. Now, when Bismarck is forced to leave office in 1890 because of his unwillingness to work with Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was not a fan of Bismarck, who he believed had too much power. Bismarck's relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm I was very good because Bismarck was in the driving seat and he really dictated how Germany behaved domestically and abroad. But Kaiser Wilhelm II has a very different outlook on the role of the Kaiser, and he comes to power in 1888, so Bismarck lasts roughly 2 years as Chancellor under Kaiser Wilhelm II, but Kaiser Wilhelm II, unlike his uncle Kaiser Wilhelm I, wants to play a much more active role in politics, especially in foreign affairs. Therefore, in 1890, some historians argue that Germany takes a new direction, or this is sometimes referred to as the new course. And this new course, with a new Chancellor, this first Chancellor under Kaiser Wilhelm II is Leo von Caprivi. This new course is going to focus more so on foreign policy than what was the case under Kaiser Wilhelm I and Bismarck. One point perhaps to note here, there is again a kind of view that Bismarck, once he's out of office, that chancellors who follow him, and that is Caprivi, Hohenlohe-Schillingsfürst, Bernhard von Bülow, and then Theobald Bethmann von Hohenweg, these chancellors don't really play the same role as Bismarck did. They have less power and they have to listen more so to the Kaiser because, as I said, Kaiser Wilhelm II is much more keen on participating in government affairs. So, what is the situation in Germany in 1890 other than just new individuals in charge of the country? Well, there are 5 things that I've listed here, and I'm just going to run through these quickly to give you an idea of the kind of position that the Germans find themselves in as we kind of approach this new century. So, first of all, population growth. If you recall from the previous lecture on domestic policies, the German population had been growing steadily and then really quickly with industrialisation. There was a fear amongst some circles within Germany that there would not be enough space within the country to manage such a growing population. So with that kind of position or viewpoint, there were calls for Germany to look for territories abroad where this surplus population could be settled. Now, where exactly this territory would be is often debated. Would it be in the Near East? Could it be in Eastern Europe? Or would it be located in colonies around the world? So, population growth arguably puts pressure on the German government to listen to some of the demands of the colonial pressure groups who would like Germany to take territories in other parts of the world, partly for status, but also partly for the practical reasons of dealing with an ever-increasing population. The second fact that Germany is very much aware of is she has basically been the the number one power in Europe when it comes to economic growth. She has caught up with the British. She's probably on a par with America at this point, although America is going through her industrial revolution. Once Germany believes that she has really developed her own domestic market to its full extent, she believes that she has to then look for new markets abroad. And maybe these new markets abroad could be acquired through territorial acquisitions in parts of Africa or parts of Asia, or maybe even within parts of Eastern or Southern Europe. So again, this suggests an outward-looking Germany in 1890. The third point I don't want to dwell on too much at the moment, because this is something that we will discuss in much greater detail when we get to History B and our study of the Nazis. But there was, even in the 1890s within Germany, a sense of German racial superiority. Now we can, as I said at the moment, ignore the kind of Jewish issue. The racial superiority here is not that different than the racial superiority that existed within Britain and in America and France, where white Europeans believed that they were superior to those living on the African continent or those living in Asia. And therefore this racial superiority, in Germany at least, meant that perhaps it would be beneficial not just to Germany to expand her territories abroad, but it would be beneficial to those who would be governed by Germans if Germany was to take land in other parts of the world. There is a very obvious example where Germany did have a colony in southwest Africa, known as Namibia nowadays, and Germany treated the local population in Namibia appallingly, and there's even some historians who have argued that prior to World War I there was evidence of genocide against the local population. But we don't have to dwell on that at the moment. The fourth reason as to why Germany may have a much more adventurous outward-looking foreign policy is purely down to the prestige that came with empire, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was really the main proponent of a desire within Germany to enhance the prestige of the country. Remember, Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandmother was Queen Victoria, therefore he was connected to the British royal family. The British, as you might be aware, were the dominant naval force in the world, and therefore Britain used her navy to control all of her dominions that were scattered across the world, some in the Caribbean, some in North America, in Canada, mostly in India, but also parts of Africa and other areas within Asia. So the Kaiser would quite like for the Germans to have an empire that could in some way resemble the British version. So there is an element of personal prestige involved in Germany's more adventurous foreign policy. And the fifth point we spoke about in the last lecture: would an aggressive, adventurous, successful foreign policy rally the nation, unite the nation, heal divisions, and for the Kaiser and his government basically destroy the Socialist Party, who had been polling successfully right up until 1912, as you are aware. So could nationalism bring the country together? And this nationalism could be based around foreign conquest. These ideas, if we take them together, put them under one heading, we could call them Weltpolitik. This was the policy that the German government referred to frequently in the 1890s and early 1900s. Weltpolitik just means world policy. Now, there were two approaches to this Weltpolitik, one direct and one indirect. The indirect version is economic imperialism, a little bit like what other countries are doing, a little bit like what the United States does in the present day, where you don't actually have to take control of a country, you just use your economic power to influence other countries to your benefit. And Germany were able to do this prior to World War I, with having relations with South American countries and with countries in the Balkans. And she had a powerful economy where she could export many of the manufactured goods that she made. Many of these actually made their way to Britain. So that is the kind of indirect approach to Weltpolitik, and it was a very successful approach, and there were some Germans who believed that this should be the approach that Germany should continue with right through the 20th century. Two wars get in the way, but if you think about Germany right now, they have the most powerful economy in Europe, so you wonder why they bothered going to war in the first place. However, different times meant that there was also a second strand to Weltpolitik. This is a much more sinister element. This is what we call Lebensraum. Now this term Lebensraum, I guess, has that sinister element to it because the Nazis would adopt this concept of Germany needing living space in the east to basically ensure the growth of the German people and the German nation. Lebensraum under the Nazis is violent and genocidal because it leads to the destruction of Poles and obviously the Holocaust and the mass murder of Jews. Lebensraum under the Kaiser's regime was never going to be something similar to what the Nazis did, right? It was really a bit more like the British version of acquiring territories around the world. The problem that Germany has in her quest for Lebensraum in Asia, or more likely Africa, is she has come late to the table when Africa was being carved up, or when Asia was being carved up. Because Britain and France and Portugal and the Belgians and a few other countries have already swallowed up most of Africa, and there's slim pickings left for the Germans. If Germany really wants to become a world power, how does it ensure that it can acquire territories without upsetting other powers in Europe who have already been successful in their attempts to acquire colonies? So, final bullet point, Germany's drive for world power status would lead to a number of crises which would eventually result in the outbreak of war. That is one historical interpretation. There are other historians who do not blame Germany, who do not think that Germany alone are to blame for all of the crises between 1890 and 1914, and therefore we will look at an alternative historical interpretation which believes in what we call collective responsibility, that all countries have to take some of the blame. However, we are primarily going to focus on Germany's foreign policy and what historians call German culpability in the causes of the First World War. Okay, let's move on and look at the next slide. Now, in this slide here, I just want to show you very briefly Germany's relationship with other European countries prior to Weltpolitik. This is before 1890. Did Germany have good relations with these four other main European powers? And I'm going to repeat some of this information as we go through today, but that's just so that I can reiterate the points and hopefully they start to sink in. Relations with France, right, we already know are not good because they weren't good under Bismarck, and the main issue that I guess still irks the French is the loss of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. And the French would quite like Alsace and Lorraine back. So that is always a potential issue for tension in Europe, and the Germans recognise that relations with France are not good, and they don't ever really, during the kind of 25 years in the build up to World War I, they don't ever really try and address the poor relations with the French. Britain, relations pre-Weltpolitik are okay, they're fine, perhaps a little bit of jealousy from the British that they now see there is a real competitor, economic competitor within Europe that will possibly rival Britain's kind of manufacturing industry and heavy industry. But things are fine there, nothing yet that will cause consternation for the British. With Russia, pre-Weltpolitik relations aren't that good, right, because there is some economic hostility, especially to do with grain, and that's because under Bismarck basically shut off Germans from accessing grain from outside of Germany, so that prices would remain high, and that would be good for German landowners. But that wasn't good for Russia. Russia had lots of grain, grain and wheat that it could sell, and the German markets were basically closed off to it. There was also fear within Germany of Russian industrialization. Russia was still pretty much a feudal country in the late 19th century, but in some cities, Moscow also being the most significant, we start to see industrial development. And there is a fear that because of the size of the Russian population, if Russia was to fully industrialise, Germany would have a real problem on her hands with such a powerful nation on her doorstep. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 is still in place, which did lead to some type of reinsurance for each side, that they would not intervene in any war, which another one of these two countries, Germany and Russia, found themselves in. And then finally, Austria. Austria, relations were pretty good. The dual alliance had been a decade old. That's the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Habsburg Empire, however, was going through a series of crises and was kind of in decline, although it will have a little kind of upturn in its fortunes in the 1900s. But on the whole, it was struggling, and maybe Germany had an alliance in which they might have to be the dominant power and dominant force within. So the Austrians quite liked being part of this alliance. It gave them security. What it really gave the Germans is more questionable. So these are pre-Weltpolitik relations. No sign at all in 1890 of war. In fact, one of the hallmarks of Bismarck's time as German Chancellor was European conflicts were pretty much non-existent. So the question is, if all was fairly peaceful in 1890, why 25 years later would these five powers that we just looked at, why would they be at war with each other? What went wrong? Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read through some key events in a chronology. Right now, this chronology is something that you will have to access. Here it is here, and here it is here. Right, there's two parts to it. Now I'm going to read through the main events. You might want to quickly jot down the ones that I mention, and then you might want to type up or write out your own version of that chronology that I give you, because some of the things on these on this kind of timeline are not relevant to what we need. So I'm just going to point out the main events, if you like, and then once we've done that, we'll throw up some questions, and then we're going to look at a couple more sources. Okay, the first one that I want you to be aware of and to kind of maybe highlight or take a note of is 1890, and that's the 15th of March, because that's when Bismarck is dismissed. And really from that point onwards, it's worth noting, German foreign policy changes. Right, Bismarck leaves office, Kaiser Wilhelm II has much greater control of Germany now, and foreign policy becomes much more adventurous or aggressive. Within a few months, 1890, 18th of June, the Reinsurance Treaty that I just spoke of with Russia is not renewed. Now, the reason why the Germans decide against renewing the Reinsurance Treaty is because they think that it kind of contradicts their alliance with Austria. Russia and Austria are enemies, right? They'd always been enemies over who would control the Balkan region. And the Germans, once Bismarck had gone, felt that could they really have two alliances, one with the Austrians and one with the Russians, when if push really came to shove and Germany had to defend one of these countries, if a war broke out, it would always be their kind of German allies, the Austrians, that they would have to pick for cultural and language reasons and historic reasons and racial reasons. So that meant that maybe this new Germany, taking this new foreign policy course, believed that it was just pointless signing this Reinsurance Treaty. To be fair, the Germans did try and say to the Russians, look, this does not mean that we want any hostility between ourselves and Russia, but it did maybe leave a slightly bad taste in the mouth of the Russians. And we see evidence eventually of Russia being forced into a new camp post lapse of the Reinsurance Treaty, because in 1894, after a couple of years of closer and closer ties, on the 4th of January, the Franco-Russian alliance is signed. We call this sometimes the dual alliance. So now you've got we sometimes call this, should use the French word for it, the dual entente. Okay, so we've now got the dual alliance of Germany and Austria, and we now have the dual entente of France and Russia. We have to get our ententes and alliances clear. So you could argue, right, that within a few years of Bismarck leaving office, with the Kaiser Wilhelm II having much more control over the German foreign policy, that maybe things have deteriorated for Germany on a European front. And what is maybe the next kind of major issue is 1898, when the first German naval law is passed. Now, you'll probably be aware of this, that once Germany starts to build a navy, Britain is going to be slightly concerned about Germany's intentions for building a navy. In 1900 we have the second German naval law, so within the space of a couple of years Germany has made it pretty clear what their intentions are when it comes to building a fleet. How would Britain react? Well, we will look at a couple of sources later on how Britain kind of responds to what will eventually become this naval race between Britain and Germany. But the British think, do the Germans really need a navy? You know, they've got a small sea outlet, but other than that, what benefits really would the Germans have from having a navy? They can't really dominate and control the world from these kind of fairly small German ports. Could the British interpret German naval building as actually an attempt to intimidate the British? We'll come back to that point. Let's move on to the next part of the chronology. Quite a lot to analyse here. The first thing is right at the top of the page, 1904, April 8th, the Anglo-French Entente. So, France now has an entente with Russia and now has an entente with Britain. Why do you think the British decided to sign this in 1904? Possibly because of the German naval building programme. You could argue that Germany has kind of very quickly from 1890 onwards has kind of pushed Britain and Russia towards the French, and that is not something that was necessarily good news for Germany. You think they may have realised what might happen if they embark upon such policies. Bismarck's main goal, if you like, during the post-unification period was to isolate France, and he was able to kind of do that for most of his time in office. That is long gone by the time we get to 1904. We then jump to 1905, and the 31st of March, Kaiser Wilhelm II lands at Tangier in Morocco. And I'll look at another example of this event later on, but basically to kind of sum this up really quickly, the French had interest in Morocco. The French wanted to control part of Morocco, and you can see that from January 1905 when the French military mission arrives at Fez in Morocco. Now, the Germans, it could be argued, decide to intervene in affairs that don't necessarily have much to do with them. If the Moroccans wanted to fight the French to stop Morocco becoming a French satellite or a French colony, then so be it. Was it the place of the Kaiser to actually make his way to Morocco to show his support for the Sultan in Morocco, to show his support that Morocco should be an independent state? Should that have been a real priority of the Kaiser, or should he have stayed out of affairs? What we get as a result of this meddling by Kaiser Wilhelm II is a conference in 1906. If you go to the 16th of January, the Algeciras conference takes place in Spain in an attempt to really address some of the issues over Morocco. Now, we don't have to worry about the complexities of these. There's one point we have to remember about the 1905 Moroccan crisis, and that is historians have argued that the reason Kaiser Wilhelm II landed in Morocco was not because he believed in the independence of the Moroccan people, it was because he hoped to test the 1904 Anglo-French Entente, i.e. would Britain, if pushed, support the French over Morocco? And at the 1906 Algeciras conference, the answer was yes. Britain said we do support France and their rights to seek more territories in this part of the world. So it seemed like a bit of a step down for the Germans. They had interfered, but they had really failed in their attempts to split the Anglo-French Entente. So that may be something again that irritates the Kaiser, and he might try once again to address this problem in the future. In 1906, the 17th of April, France gives an incredibly large amount of money to the Russians. 2.2 billion francs make their way from France to Russia. This is going to help the Russians carry on industrialising, but also to basically improve their military. Okay, next event worth highlighting is 1906, the 5th of June. We have the third naval law in Germany ratified by the Reichstag. This is the Reichstag that we spoke about in the last lecture. You know, it's still very much a pro-government Reichstag in 1906. And the German third naval law means that Germany is really focusing on building one particular type of ship, the Dreadnought. Britain recognises this. Britain really starts to think that the Germans have got ill intent with their building of this navy. So much so that the British look for further protection. What's quite remarkable, because Britain and Russia had really been enemies in Asia for 100 years or so. They signed an alliance in 1907. So 1907, the 31st of August, we have the Anglo-Russian Entente. So what was two dual ententes, France and Russia, Britain and France, could now become, and you might want to take a note of this, in 1907, the Triple Entente. These three countries have now accepted that it might be in their interest to unite together, and it would be difficult to look at the Triple Entente from a German perspective and not think that the Triple Entente is anything but directed at you. The Germans are going to start to feel the pressure of having these three countries surrounding them and being antagonistic. That's the German mindset. The next event to highlight is the 6th of October 1908. Bosnia and Herzegovina is annexed by Austria-Hungary. Why is that a significant event? Well, again, it's a complex event, but ultimately the Austrians wanted Bosnia, right? It would kind of boost the morale of the Austrian people, adding a new piece of territory to their empire. They decided they're going to annex Bosnia. The Russians would obviously have a say in that because it's within the Balkan region, and the Russians also obviously had influence here. The Russians actually tried to do a deal with Austria where they said, look, we'll let you take Bosnia, but can we get access to the Bosphorus Straits, which was sea access in the kind of Mediterranean? And Austria pretended that they would support Russia on this, but when push came to shove, they did not, and the Russians kind of felt cheated. And so did the Serbs, who believed that Bosnia should not be part of the Austrian Empire, but should be part of the greater Serbian Empire. So post 1908, Russia kind of feels that maybe she has to maybe defend Serbia a bit more as an ally. Maybe she felt she'd let the Serbs down, and she definitely hated Austria for being kind of double-crossed. So I think Serbia and Russia come a little bit closer together as a result of this 1908 Bosnian crisis, and the Russians really feel cheated by the Austrians. So it's actually more an anti-Austrian feeling within Russia at this point rather than anti-German, because Germany and Austria are part of an alliance. Then hatred of Austria would also maybe mean potential conflict with Germany. Final thing I want to focus on is 1911, 21st of May, French troops occupy Fez, Morocco. So this was France saying, look, we are going to take the territory that we said we would back in 1905. And how did the Germans respond? Well, maybe they shouldn't have responded, but they do. And on the 1st of July, they send a gunboat to the Moroccan coastal town of Agadir. And this Panther gunboat really has one purpose, and that purpose is to show the French that the Germans still believe that Morocco should be an independent nation. In 1911, there probably was some feeling, or there definitely was some feeling across Europe, as indicated in newspapers at the time, that maybe war could break out as early as 1911. Eventually there is a deal done, and Germany are given a little bit of land in Africa to make up for France taking Morocco. Again, it seems it was just like German intervention just to cause trouble more than anything else. They did not split the Triple Alliance, or the Triple Entente, sorry. as a consequence of the second, what we call the second Moroccan crisis. So the first Moroccan crisis, 1905, the second Moroccan crisis, 1911. Now, I want to kind of leave things there at the moment. There is another key event in 1912 I want to talk about later on. It's called the War Council meeting, but we'll talk about that when we study the short-term causes of the war. And whilst I'm talking about the short-term causes of the war, I'm not going to run through this right now, but I want you to just take a note of what is on the right-hand side of this page. And from the moment that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, is assassinated on 20th of June 1914, right through until the 4th of August when Britain declares war on Germany, we call this period the July Crisis. Okay, the July Crisis. And this is what we're going to study in a separate lecture because it's quite complicated, right? And it's fundamental to your assessment. So we'll come back to the July Crisis in future. So, quite a lot of events that I threw at you there, but as I said, you might want to write these down yourself, and you know, if there's some way that you can make your own little timeline, so be it. And that might be quite useful. It means that you can ignore a lot of the other events that are on this chronology. Okay, key developments. I want to just show you a few little sources here before we conclude. German relations with Britain, as you know, deteriorate over this German naval building programme that we spoke about. German relationships with Russia deteriorate due to the reinsurance treaty lapsing, but also economic competition, and then the Bosnian crisis. And German relations with France have always been poor, partly as a result of the Moroccan crisis, but also that 1871 annexation of Alsace and Lorraine. A couple of little sources, all going well. If they work, I can point out to you. Okay, I want to focus on this second one here that says document B. Now, this here is it's quite an interesting source. It comes from the British armaments manufacturer Vickers, the very famous British producer of things like tanks and so on, as we get into the 20th century. And the firm sent their director, A.J. Dawson, to Germany just to kind of see how the German government themselves were getting on with their production of armaments, but especially in regards to naval building. And what Dawson finds is that the Germans are building a navy really with one particular focus or idea in mind. So he says, in very high circles in Germany, it is considered to be a question of national existence to possess large and useful colonies for the immigration of the constantly increasing population of the country and for the purpose of creating markets for German exports. That was the point I raised in the very first slide. This is maybe what the Germans thought they had to do to address their economic expansion and their increasing population. And what Dawson felt through his conversations was that the Germans believed that the best colonies were in the hands of England, right, or Britain. And maybe the only way that Germany could become this world power and to address our potential problems was to take colonies from England or Britain. Now, how that could be done would either be through war or through negotiation, or what the Germans hoped would be through kind of threats. Maybe not go to war, but if you build up a navy strong enough, the British will have to accept that there's a new player in town, and Germany therefore have to be respected, and Germany should just be given tracts of British land in the colonies. When I say British land, obviously I mean British in inverted commas, because it did not belong to the British. It had been stolen or taken by force by the British over the years. The Germans thought, according to Dawson, they had to build as many dreadnoughts as possible and compete with the British Navy and maybe even defeat the British Navy. And in the process, if they did, what they would receive in return was war reparations, but also British colonies. So that's one particular view. It's a British view of the Germans, so we'd have to question the source in that respect. He's not given us any direct quotes or evidence, but it's a useful source. The second one I want to touch on is this one here, which comes from Winston Churchill, Now this is when Churchill is, this is 1912, right, so long before he becomes Prime Minister. This is when Churchill is the First Lord of the Admiralty, right, so he's basically the Cabinet Minister in the government responsible for the British Navy. And what, this is a little bit later, this is 1912 in fact, it's post-Second Moroccan Crisis. And what Churchill really says here is, look, having a navy is essential to Britain because we are an island, and it's essential to our trade. You know, we need to trade with other countries via this navy. And for Germany, he says it's not an essential. It's not an essential for the Germans. It's a luxury for Germany because, you know, Germany can trade via land, via train, to France, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to Denmark, to Russia, to what would eventually become Poland, to the Balkan countries, and Britain doesn't really have that. So what Churchill starts to think in 1912 is, you know, why are Germany exactly building this navy? Well, if it's not out of necessity, then maybe it's to challenge us, to challenge the British. And Churchill's trying to say to the Germans, you don't have to build a navy, we already recognise you as a great power. In fact, he says that, he says, but Germany was a great power, respected and honoured all over the world before she had a single ship. Whereas the British had these ships for trading purposes and protection, the Germans were building them for what reason? It appeared that there could only be one reason, and that was to challenge the British Navy and therefore the British Empire. So we can start to see that the British have got a pretty sceptical view of why Germany is engaging in the expansion of her naval fleet, and maybe it's not a surprise for why Britain signs the alliance with France and then the alliance with Russia. Okay, as I've mentioned already, there's relations between Germany and France which are constantly deteriorating, and I just want to very quickly click on one final source, and this is to do with the Moroccan crisis of 1905. Again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but it gives you an indication. I should say the source comes from Councillor von Schoen, an envoy in the Imperial Suite to the German office. So this is someone who is very much aware of Kaiser Wilhelm II's decision to come to Morocco in 1905. He basically is saying that the Kaiser is coming to ensure that Morocco remains an independent nation. In fact, he says here at the bottom, His Majesty was highly satisfied with his visit, especially the confidential message of the Sultan. And he says that the Sultan would always inform the Kaiser of any changes or reforms that might take place within Morocco. It does seem that the Germans are just being obtuse and awkward because the French had already, rightly or wrongly, had already shown an interest in Morocco. And here were the Germans coming along and saying, oh wait a minute, we think that Morocco should be an independent state. This is obviously going to upset the French. It's obviously going to irritate the French. And it looks like the Kaiser is engaging in another example of poor diplomacy. When you read the stuff on My City, you'll get more examples of this apparent poor diplomacy and poor decision making from the German government when it came to foreign affairs. So, German relations with all of these countries deteriorate, and you know by 1907 we have this triple entente, and what, well I should say this is a poster post Moroccan crisis as well, and it's John Bull and Madame France looking at Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the cartoon saying only William's way. In fact, I might even be a little indication of it here. Yeah, and this is again from 1905, the first Moroccan crisis, and basically the British and the French are saying, you know, the Kaiser thinks he really is something, right? They believe the Kaiser and the Germans to be arrogant, and that's because the Kaiser, in a speech to the Reichstag in November of 1905, had said, in foreign policy, the relations of the German Empire with all the powers, that's the main powers, are correct, and with most powers, they are good and friendly. So the British and French are saying, look, the Germans think that they are engaging in good relations with foreign powers. That is not the case. They are meddling in affairs that have nothing to do with them. Okay, I did mention the Triple Entente signed in 1907. All of those examples we looked at in the sources maybe show why the Triple Entente had been created. We've got a good sense now as to why Britain, France and Russia may have decided to direct this Entente perhaps against Germany. The Germans, as we've seen with that little speech from the Kaiser, might be slightly deluded, right? They think they're acting absolutely fine, and therefore when they start to believe that they are being encircled, right? France to the west, Russia to the east, Britain over here in the sea, the Germans start to think they are being encircled. Right? A key concept in the build-up to World War I is encirclement. We will look at a source on encirclement in a future online lesson. Germany thinks that other countries are ganging up on her, and that her opportunities to thrive as a new nation are being denied by the old status quo, Russia, France and Britain. And the only outlet that Germany has is her ally to the south, Austria-Hungary. And that might mean when things get tough and when Austria-Hungary feel pressure from Serbia in 1914, that Germany has no option but to defend Austria because she has no other real potential friends in Europe. Now, is that the fault of the Germans? Have the Germans pushed themselves into this encirclement, or have Britain, France and Russia themselves acted to try and constrain any German attempts at expansion or progress? Okay, I'll discuss more about the online activities on My City that you have to do in an email. So, for now, that is us finished with our lecture on German behaviour, German foreign policy in the period 1890 to 1913. Thank you.